Good morning, everyone. This is Lecture 7, Secular Music of the Renaissance. Secular performers of the Renaissance included both professionals and amateurs. Professional musicians played at court or for town festivals and ceremonies. Amateur musicians mainly played at home. They played guitar or lute or keyboard, even though early harpsichords had very limited range. Everyone was expected to sing or play an instrument. It was an important leisure activity. Girls particularly were expected to sing or play. Secular music had livelier rhythms than its sacred counterpart, and the secular texts were in the vernacular, that is, the language of the people. In France, for example, folk songs were sung in French, and the rhythm of the language helped define the musical rhythm. I'd like you to pause and listen to Je Vis le Loup by the Baltimore Consort. This is a song whose text goes, I saw the wolf, the fox, the hare. I saw the wolf, the fox drinking. I spied on them myself. I saw the wolf, the fox, the hare. I spied on them myself. I saw the wolf, the fox drinking. The second verse is the same, except they see the wolf and the fox singing, and they imitate them. In the third verse, same, I saw the wolf, the fox, the hare. I saw the wolf, the fox dancing. I made them dance myself. I saw the wolf, the fox, the hare. I made them dance myself. I saw the wolf, the fox dancing. So enjoy this piece by the Baltimore Consort. It's a good example of how the language of French affects the rhythm of the piece. And you'll hear the livelier sounds of secular music. Chansons, or songs, were a favorite of the courts of France. Frequently, there were three voices written where one or both of the lower voices are played by instruments. It's complete with love poetry. Our old friend Josquin wrote secular songs as well as sacred music, and in 1520 wrote a piece called Mille Regrets. Notice that this is not a fixed form like the music of the Middle Ages. Remember the rondeau, R-O-N-D-E-A-U, which was the capital A, capital B, small a, capital A, etc. But rather, this is a through composed piece. The text is a 4-line poem that goes like this. 1,000 regrets for deserting you and leaving behind your loving face. I have such great sorrow and grievous pain that one can see that my days will not be long. You can see that it's treble dominated. That is, when you listen to it, you'll hear mainly the treble voice as standing out principally. But you can also see that the way that it's written, particularly in measures 17 on, lends itself to be the focus of the tune. This, because it is a secular piece, could have been sung using female singers. And while there's much homorhythmic texture, there are still points of imitation, which we talked about last time. Points of imitation meaning brief sections of imitative polyphony. Its Phrygian mode portrays the text's sadness. So pause the video and click on the link below and listen to Mille Regrets by Josquin. Madrigals were a favorite of the Italian courts. Madrigals were short compositions set to one stanza of poetry, frequently pastoral poetry. Pastoral poetry is about shepherds and their purity and the simplicity of the shepherd's life. Although that it's frequently pastoral, other themes sometimes exist as well, such as politics, love, humorous subjects, or scenes from life. One of the main ideas that occur in madrigals is word painting or text painting. Word painting is an emotional or dramatic technique. Word painting expresses a word in musical terms, such as the word running, if found in the text, would be accompanied by fast or 16th notes. If the word alone appeared in the text, a solo singer might sing it. If the word weeping appeared in the text, it might be portrayed by a descending or a chromatic line. If the word sighing appeared in the text, it might be portrayed with a descending half step. Madrigals progressed through the 16th century from the early madrigals, which were quite simple, to the middle period madrigals, which had more text painting, to the late madrigals, which were much more complex and virtuosic. Madrigal composers in the Italian style included Jacques Arcadelt, born somewhere around 1507 and living until 1568. Arcadelt was a Franco-Flemish composer, but was active in both France and Italy. He composed primarily secular vocal music and was an early composer of madrigals. His publications are the main reason that madrigals were known outside Italy. He published 4 books of madrigals by 1539. We're going to look at one of his madrigals called Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno. This is a text by Alfonso d'Avalos. The white and sweet swan dies singing, and I, weeping, come to the end of my life. Strange and different fate, that it dies disconsolate, and I die happy. A death that in dying fills me fully with joy and desire. If when I die no other pain I feel, with 1,000 deaths a day I would be content. A little strange, isn't it, that poem? At first it looks like it's about death, and so it is, the swan and I. But is it? Death does come to the swan, but death is also a metaphor for sexual climax. So if you think of it in that way, it puts a whole new spin on the text. Let's look at the word painting. The words are written out in English underneath the text, so it'll be easier for you to see. In measure 3 and 4, the translation is swan, singing, dies, technically. So if we look at the tenor part, we can see that when the words swan and singing are there, that the tenor part moves up. When it says dying, the tenor part moves down. Actually, all of the voice parts, other than the alto, move down. Look at the bass. In the second system, measure 1, weeping. Look at the chromatic turn that the music takes. I, weeping, come to the end of my life. Later in the same line, we see end of my life, and look at the contour of the melodies moving downward. If we look at the top of the second page, especially in the soprano part, we see the word happy. Okay? I die happy. Look at the way that the soprano takes that word happy and rhythmically pronounces it. Later in the same line, the rhythm slows when there's talk of death, a death that in dying. And look at moving from the quicker eighth notes that we see in the first 4 measures, or 3 measures rather, of the second page, to a homorhythmic quarter note rhythm slowing to half notes in dying. Now the biggest one. Look at the text with 1,000 deaths. De mille morts. Starting with measure 45, or the box 45, which is measure 34 actually. Look at how many times you see D-I, M-I-L-L-E, M-O-R-T. Look how many times that occurs. It occurs in the alto in measure 34. It occurs in the alto and the tenor in measure 35, added to a little bit in the second beat by the bass in measure 35. It occurs in the next measure on all 4 voices. Again in the next measure with the top 3 voices. We see it continuing in the alto in the next voice. We see it continuing in the bass and the tenor and the alto in the next measure into measure 40. We see it continuing in the soprano in measure 40 and measure 41. And then we see it again in measure 42 and measure 43 in all of the voices, lower voices. And finally, it wraps up in the last 3 measures, last 2 measures, with quarter notes slowing into the cadence. All of those de mille morts with 1,000 deaths. And you hear it nearly 1,000 times. Not really, but it seems like that. And finally, we have in the cadence content, right? I would be content, and it wraps up and comes to a close. So that's a good example of an early to mid madrigal, mid-period madrigal from 1538 by Jacques Arcadelt. So pause the video and enjoy Il Bianco e Dolce Cigno. Now for somebody completely different. Carlo Gesualdo, born in 1566, died in 1613. Carlo Gesualdo was the Prince of Venosa, the Count of Conza. He was a composer and a lutenist. He married his first cousin, who happened to be widowed twice. Her name was Maria d'Avalos, and she was a few years older than he. And it did not take very long into their marriage before she had an affair. Well, word came to Gesualdo that this is what was going on, and there was no way he was going to be a cuckold or made to look like a fool, and so he set a trap to catch them. When he caught them, he and his soldiers, his buddies, killed the wife with a knife. They cut her throat, and her lover was killed by sword and gunshots. He's definitely a little bit off, which we can hear in the madrigals. I'd like you to look at the text of Moro Lasso from 1613 when it was published. I die, alas, in my suffering, and she who could give me life, alas, kills me and will not help me. O sorrowful fate, she who could give me life, alas, gives me death. Pause the video and listen to Moro Lasso. I think it will surprise you. The English madrigal was first popular in the late 16th century. The first collection of Italian madrigals was published in England and called Music from Beyond the Alps, where the texts were just translated into English. Other than that, they were Italian madrigals. But the English people really enjoyed them and began to write their own kinds of English madrigals. But truly English madrigals had much simpler texts. John Farmer, who flourished, that is, he was active between 1591 and 1601, was born in England but worked for most of his life in Dublin, Ireland, as an organist and choir master at Christ Church. A few years before his death, in 1599, he moved to London and published his only collection of four-part madrigals. I don't think you'll need to see the text first because you'll be able to understand the English, but listen for the text painting when you pause the video. Renaissance secular music would be remiss without talking about instrumental music. Much of instrumental music was dance music. These dance music included cosmopolitan-style dances, for example, the French pavane and galliard, the Italian saltarello, the German allemande, and each having its own characteristic time or tempo and style. But there were other dances as well, such as the ronde, which we have already talked about a little bit in terms of Sumerze kommen in. Instrumental music was somewhat similar to the Middle Ages music. Some of the instruments carried over, and instruments included both the indoor and the outdoor type. For example, indoor instruments were the softer instruments, instruments that could be played indoors without jarring the system, such as stringed instruments or wind instruments like a recorder or some of the quieter ones. Outdoor instruments were those instruments that you could only stand outside, such as the double reed instruments like the shawm. Here are a couple other instruments that we can add to our Middle Ages list. We see crumhorns developing in the Renaissance. Crumhorns are double reed instruments, but you can't see the double reed, as you can tell on this picture, because it is covered by a cap. Therefore, these are called capped reeds. The cap is almost like a sippy cup, and it fits right over the end of the reed and helps to focus the air. Crumhorns came in families from the bass to the sopranino and had finger holes just like the other wind instruments. So pause the video and watch crumhorns. Sackbuts. I know everybody laughs at that. Sackbuts are early trombones. Sackbuts, actually, the term came from sachbout, which was a French term meaning pull push. You can see why it would be pull push as it changes its pitch through the pushing and the pulling of the slide. These instruments are very similar in sound to the trombone, except look at the bell. They're definitely not as flared, and so the sound is a little bit softer and a little bit less focused. The video that you can pause and watch now uses a bass sackbut. The cornetto, or just cornet, is a trumpet-like sound due to its style of mouthpiece. There's a mouthpiece that you buzz into just the same as modern trumpets, but it has finger holes like the early wind instruments. So this does not become anything modern like the sackbut kind of grew into the trombone. Rather, this was an instrument all on its own. You can still see people who play cornetto today, and it's a really cool sound. It's almost got a vocal-like quality to it. So pause the video and listen to the cornetto. Our composer for instrumental music is Tilman Susato, who was born somewhere around 1515 and lived until 1571. Susato was a professional sackbut player, but he was also a composer, also a music printer in Antwerp, Belgium. He wrote a piece, among others, called Three Dances, or Ronds, round dances. These dances were dances that were mainly performed outside or outdoors and much less in courts. They were duple meter and binary, and originally it was a country dance. The recording that's on the link features shawms and sackbuts and cornetos as well as percussion. So enjoy Tilman Susato's Three Dances. We're going to transition from the Renaissance to the Baroque through our composer in Venice. Venice was the musical center for choir masters and organists because of its large basilica, San Marco. You may want to know what the difference is between a cathedral and a basilica. A cathedral is the home church for a bishop or an archbishop, whereas a basilica received its designation from the Pope because of its special spiritual or historical and or architectural meaning. San Marco's Basilica had the perfect setup for polychoral and antiphonal music. The church had several balconies and 2 organs, and it was in the shape of a cross. You can see where there would be organs at each side of the cross. Usually, a choir was placed at each organ, but other choirs could be placed in different locations in the church, so it was a real true surround sound. Additional instruments could also be placed in the church and added to the choir's sound. The instruments were usually of the string or wind type. It was an impressive place for rituals and ceremonies. By the way, instruments were probably added back into church by about the 15th century. So the organ had been in church, but other instruments were also added back in little by little. Giovanni Gabrieli was born in around 1557 and lived until 1612. He studied music in Venice with his uncle Andrea Gabrieli. Giovanni was the master of church music. He was organist at San Marco when he was 27 years old. He wrote works to be heard in the basilica. Only a few of his compositions, however, appeared in print during his lifetime. Most were published posthumously. Not only did he write music for choir, but he also wrote purely instrumental music. The early music of Gabrieli combined traits of both the Renaissance and what we'll know soon as Baroque. He used double or triple choirs placed in stereo, called cori spezzati, or spaced choirs, in the cathedral, and this shows the magnificence like what we'll see in the Baroque. Also the antiphonal music of what we saw in the Renaissance. This antiphonal style alternates, as we saw with chant when it was done antiphonally. The alternating style creates echo effects and contrasts, like we will see in the Baroque. The many voice textures of his vocal polyphony is very much like the Renaissance. And Gabrieli uses techniques like modal harmonies and word paintings, which is also common to the Renaissance. But in his later music, we see some very important contributions. So other than continuing the antiphonal style with cori spezzati, the spaced choirs, Gabrieli was one of the very first composers who notated the instruments in the score. He's also credited with being the first composer to notate dynamics in the score. So that's pretty big, even though both of the lower two, notating the instruments and notating the dynamics, weren't terribly consistent. The fact is, we have record that he did so. I'd like you to pause the video and listen to Canzone Septimi Toni from 1597. This canzone, or canzona, was an instrumental imitative piece. It has its roots in the chanson, and it's Italian and used in instrumental music for both keyboard and other instruments. So enjoy the Canzone Septimi Toni and pause the video now.